Hey, Push Nation, how you doing? Good evening. Welcome in. Tonight I'm going to be talking about something that continues our discussion we started today, which is how in the world did the Continental Army go on to defeat the mightiest army in all of the world at the time, the British. Keep in mind, the war between the British and the colonies began exactly as that. It was a war that began in the spring of '75. And at the time, all of the colonies were still independent of one another. But after talking today about the Declaration of Independence importance, we know now that these colonies are now states of a United States of America. And that meant that fighting the war against the British was no longer just a matter of a Massachusetts war or a Massachusetts rebellion. This is now a war that unites all 13 of the former colonies who are now states. And when you look at the challenges that were facing the Continental Army as it prepared for war against Britain, I just want to remind you that the Continental Army was actually formed even before the independence was declared. But the Continental Army really didn't serve the purpose that it ultimately will, which is protecting the 13 states. And there's two central issues that I'm going to really focus on tonight: regionalism and localism. These are the two chief problems that the Continental Army is going to face as it fights a war against the British. Now, before I do that, though, let's talk about who were the people fighting in the Continental Army. It's a really interesting and fascinating point. The Continental Army was primarily made up of volunteers. There was, at the beginning of the war, no draft or anything like that, so people volunteered typically to serve in the Army. And the strange thing about who was serving is you got to keep in mind the colonists and now the 13 states, they didn't have a professional standing army at any point in their history because, after all, they were colonies of the British Empire. So there was no colonial army that ever formed. Think back to the French and Indian War discussion when each colony formed its own militia, which was there to protect the colony. But these were informal groups of people that banded together as soldiers to protect the interests of their colonies at a certain point. But now we're going up against the mightiest empire in the entire world. And this would be this is on a scale of trying to compare, just how mighty a task the Continental Army has. I mean, the British military was the baddest military on the planet. And here's a group of really a bunch of ragtag common citizens that all of a sudden are thrust into a war against professionally trained, professionally paid soldiers from the British Empire. Most of the people who served in the Continental Army were regular guys. And by the way, women did not serve except for like maybe a few exceptions of women disguising themselves as men, which did happen. But keep in mind, these are mostly men, and in some cases, that term men is pretty loose. Most of you boys in the class of 16, 17 years old, you probably would have been fighting at this age. So when I say men, typically we're looking at young, what we call today young males, or even some cases boys. But the age range was really wide open. I mean, if you were between 16, 17, 18, all the way up to 45, you probably would have been considering joining the Continental Army. But these were simply put regular guys. They were butchers, bakers, teachers, lawyers, doctors. Very few had professional military experience. And if they did, it was either fighting Native Americans at some point or most likely it was from the French Indian War. So you got these regular Joes, these regular Johns, these regular Pauls, and whoever they were, now tasked with defending a nation, recently declaring its independence against the toughest military on the planet. Just what an insurmountable task these men faced. And on top of the men that had to fight the war, let's talk about the simple fact was, how were they getting financed? How are they getting supplied? Who was making decisions regarding what to do with the army? Well, that was actually part of the Second Continental Congress's job. And the Second Continental Congress, along with coming up with the Declaration of Independence, it was tasked with sort of serving as a wartime government, which eventually will form the Articles of Confederation, but that doesn't happen right away. And so funding and supplying the war, there's a lot of irony here. First of all, think, where are the colonies getting most of their supplies? Well, they were getting them from Britain at one point until all the protests and the boycotts began. So it's like, shoot, we've been boycotting and protesting and aiming to go away from all these British goods, but wait a second, now that we're in a war, it'd be nice to have those. So there's this sense of irony when it comes to the supply problem. Some of the things you got to keep in mind here, and we'll talk about this with the Declaration discussion earlier today. The last thing the Americans wanted to do was institute a tyrannical centralized government. But in a war, you need a centralized government. How are you going to fight a war without any centralization of power? How are you going to raise money? How are you going to supply the troops? How are you going to arm the troops? And speaking of arm, listen to this crazy idea that Benjamin Franklin came up with. Benjamin Franklin actually at one point during a meeting with the Continental Congress proposed that the Continental Army should fight with bows and arrows. Why? Because it was a heck of a lot faster to load a bow and arrow than it was to load a rifle at the time. But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when it comes to lack of supplies. A lot of the Patriot Army and a lot of the Continental Army soldiers were fighting with mallets and clubs and rocks. And I'm not making that up, and hatchets. And here they are again trying to fight the professionally trained British with all their manpower, with all their supply chain. So supplying the army fell to the task of the Continental Congress. But again, they're very weary of centralizing power. They're very weary of raising taxes. And so really the whole idea of revenue raising fell upon the states. The Continental Congress tried to entrust the states, which was an ineffective process on its own, to raise taxes because, gee, surprise, surprise, why are we in the war in the first place? Well, I think taxes had something to do with it. So you're seeing that one of the big problems here, supplying and raising an army is not cheap, nor is it easy to get those amounts of supplies to actually get the guys into battle and able to fight off the British. And the Continental Congress was really ineffective almost throughout the entire war at this process. And it would take a Herculean effort by a lot of the individual states to raise money. And one of the common ways they did this was actually through a lottery system. The modern lottery where you go into a gas station at QT, buy a lottery ticket, well, it draws its roots back from actually the Revolutionary War. A lot of states had lotteries where people could buy tickets, and a lot of the currency that they generated would go towards helping to fund the troops. Now, speaking of troops, who's going to lead these guys? This ragtag, bunch of volunteers. Well, the task was under much debate. And since the war had, of course, begun in Massachusetts, there was a lot of movement that the war should be the commander-in-chief, I should say, of the Continental Army should be a Massachusetts man. And a lot of people were motioning for John Hancock to be the guy because he was a big name and he was, well known in the boycott and all that as a smuggler. But John Hancock was actually turned down, and who got the job was thanks to a recommendation from John Adams. And this kind of ticked off Hancock. I mean, Adams and Hancock were both from Massachusetts, but Hancock was soured, and instead George Washington was appointed by the Continental Congress as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And Washington was an interesting choice. First of all, again, he was from Virginia. So many New Englanders looked down on George Washington, and after all, the conflict would start in New England. And Washington himself really looked down on New Englanders. And this brings me back to my point of regionalism of the war. Remember how diverse the economies and the social life was? Well, Virginia was part of the Southern economy. It was part of the gentility class. The gentry had a great deal of power, and Washington was a really rich guy. He married Martha Washington, who was one of the wealthiest women in the colonies due to inheritance from her husband. And Martha, George's wife, bestowed upon George all her wealth that she had gained and had to give up once in marriage. So Washington's a wealthy guy. He's a society guy. He liked to party. He liked to dance. He was a fancy pants. He actually had all his, I just did call George Washington fancy pants, by the way. He had all his clothes made, hand-tailored in Britain. He was a sophisticated guy, but he was also an imposing guy. George Washington was about 6'3", 6'4", which by today's standards isn't really all that tall. But when the average male's height was about my height, 5'6" at the time, a 6'4", that's a long way to look up. That's like me looking at Ted or something every day. And you can see Ted already, and Ted, you're getting a lot of love here. Ted cuts an imposing figure, but imagine Ted on a horse, and that's George Washington. So Washington really cut this imposing, powerful figure. He just looked like a leader, He looked like someone who could command troops. And don't forget, he had all that experience in the French and Indian War. But Washington really looked down upon New Englanders. In fact, I'm quoting him here, that he said that New Englanders are exceedingly dirty and nasty people. And yet here's the army that George Washington is now in charge of. And so Washington immediately has some issues with the regionalization of the army. New Englanders and Southerners don't get along very well, but now he's got to command these guys, and he's got to get them to fight again against the best army in the world. And I'm now going to bring in Vanessa because she's helping us out this week, and Vanessa's going to share with you a little anecdote on how difficult it was for Washington and other troops, and other leaders, I should say, to command these new Continental Army troops. So Vanessa, please take it away.
Late 1700s, soldiers were unaware of how the military functioned and how the army was organized. So they basically had to be taught everything from scratch. Basic skills such as marching became a difficulty because soldiers were unaware of the difference between left foot and right foot. But what they did know was agricultural terminology. So what trainers would often do was to associate agricultural terms with direction. For example, left foot would equal hay, and right foot would equal straw. Not to be confused with drinking straw, but the actual hay and straw from farms. Here's an example.
Soldiers! Today I'm going to teach you how to march. This is your hay foot, and this is your straw foot. Now march, let's go. Hay, straw, hay, straw, hay. Oh my God. Arcash! Soldiers, up! This is your hay foot, this is your straw foot. You mess up, you run!
Sorry, Commander.
Soldiers! Hay, straw, hay, straw, hay, straw, hay, straw. Good!
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed Vanessa and Company's little anecdote there, and that should help reinforce how difficult a task it was to train these soldiers. But I also want to bring up and just wrap up the whole point about regionalism and then do a brief thing on localism. So again, regionalism being that the different regions of the states sort of held each other in a little bit of disdain because of their regional differences. But then also localism. The problem with localism boiled down to the idea that your local issues were much greater in terms of hierarchy than the national issues. People were very fearful of giving up their local power, especially the state assemblies, which were scrambling to write constitutions during this whole period of time, and also the local militias in each state were not ready to just sort of give in and join the Continental Army. And people typically were still more consumed with their local issues than they were national issues. So when you factor that into the idea that the regions were so distinctive of one another, how in the heck did these people come together to fight in a war? And how the heck did they end up pulling off the greatest upset in military history? And that may be debatable, and maybe you can think of a better upset along the course of history, but you'll be very hard pressed to find such a stunning upset in world history. And again, George Washington, I hope you guys are getting a sense. He is going to be such a pivotal figure. And I'll talk more about Washington as we go on through class. But the sheer fact of supplying and funding an army, training an army, getting the ideology amongst the states, not the colonies any longer, they're the states. Those were insurmountable tasks that fell on top of the Continental Congress in the early stages of the war. And over time, this is going to present numerous challenges, numerous roadblocks towards success. And yet somehow, these patriots and the Continental Army and George Washington, the Continental Congress, all together, they pulled off a great upset. And we'll be piecing the answers as to how along more as we go these next couple of weeks. So I hope you guys have a great evening. I'll end as I always do. The past shapes the future. Have a good night, everyone.